The fluorescent lights in the security office buzzed overhead, casting sterile shadows on the linoleum floor. No one moved. No one breathed. The weight in the room had shifted, not because of the uniforms or the rank stitched onto a shoulder, but because of the quiet, deliberate authority held between the fingers of a man in a gray suit. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply raised a badge. And in that moment, the four armed officers standing around the woman in the worn cardigan stepped back like a tide retreating from shore. The woman sat slumped in a plastic chair, wrists trembling from where they'd been gripped too tightly minutes before. Her name was Amina Wells, 31, black, pregnant. She hadn't screamed when they took her phone, hadn't protested when they locked the door. She'd just sat, hands folded over her belly, staring at the blank wall as if trying to remember what safety used to feel like. Now, with the arrival of the man in the gray suit, something shifted. The air no longer belonged to the security guards. It belonged to him. "Release her," he said calmly, placing the federal ID on the desk like a scalpel on an operating table. "Now!" One guard, a younger one, barely out of academy, glanced at the others, searching for a reason to disobey. He found none. The cuffs were unlatched. Amina's fingers twitched, then slowly curled into her lap. The room was silent except for the soft creak of plastic as she leaned forward, not rising yet, just breathing again. "What's going on?" the head guard asked, voice brittle with confusion. "What's going on?" the man replied, turning his eyes toward the wall of flickering security feeds. "Is that you've detained a woman under suspicion of theft, without evidence, without protocol, and without a warrant. She was seen sitting in a room. That's not theft. That's called waiting for her appointment." A pause. "I'm Agent Malcolm Hart, Department of Justice," he added. "And unless you want to explain this to a federal judge, I suggest you cue up the footage, every second, every angle, especially the moment your staff decided a black woman alone must be guilty of something." The guard swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the sweat gathering at his temples. As the footage began to roll on the monitors, Amina lifted her head. Her eyes, brown, glassy, but steady, met Malcolm's for the first time. He gave a single nod, almost imperceptible, but full of weight. "You're not alone anymore," it said. "Not today." And in that instant, the story changed. This wasn't about a misplaced watch. It was about a system that had just collided, violently and publicly, with someone finally willing to hold up a mirror. 3 weeks earlier, Amina Wells had stood barefoot on the cold tiles of her bathroom, toothbrush in one hand, the other resting on the soft curve of her stomach. The mirror fogged slightly from the shower steam, obscuring the dark circles beneath her eyes. She didn't wipe it away. She just stared. It was 6:17 a.m. Outside, the city was barely waking. Inside their modest one-bedroom apartment in Glenfield, Ohio, everything was already moving. Her husband's coffee percolating in the kitchen, the radio murmuring headlines about rising rents and falling patients, and in the corner of her mind, a quiet, persistent thrum of worry. Amina was a high school English teacher, or had been, until her contract ended abruptly last fall under the vague cloud of district restructuring. She hadn't taught since. Instead, she spent mornings applying for jobs and afternoons rubbing cocoa butter on her expanding belly while counting down the weeks until she could breathe easier, financially, emotionally, physically. At 31, this pregnancy hadn't been planned, but neither had it been unwanted. It was just hard. Harder than she'd expected. She hadn't told her family back in Alabama yet. They'd asked too many questions about money, about the father, about why she sounded tired every time they called. Her husband Malcolm worked for the DOJ. He traveled often. Civil rights investigations, field reports, hearings in cities where the weight of justice came slow and heavy. He loved her fiercely, but from a distance that neither of them quite knew how to bridge lately. Still, they tried. That morning, Amina had dressed carefully for her prenatal appointment, second trimester checkup at Eastbrook Medical, one of the few clinics that accepted her temporary insurance. She wore soft gray slacks and a blouse that buttoned high at the neck. Her afro was pulled back, edges smooth. No makeup, just lip balm. She looked like someone trying not to be seen, because that was safer. At 10:41 a.m., she walked through the clinic doors and into the lobby. The receptionist barely glanced up. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. Women with strollers shifted impatiently. Nurses called names with robotic tones. Amina smiled gently, signed her name, and sat. She did not cause a scene. She did not raise her voice. She did what she had done her whole life, shrunk herself to fit the room. And then Dr. Lindsay Halbert entered. White coat pristine, blonde hair pulled tight, a clipboard clutched like a shield. She called Amina's name, glanced at her belly, then turned sharply toward exam room 3. Amina followed. She didn't know then that this woman, this doctor, had already made a decision about her. Not based on her chart, not based on her words, based on how tired her clothes looked, how unaccompanied she seemed, how invisible she tried to be. She didn't know that the kindness in her eyes would be seen as manipulation, that her politeness would be read as deceit. She didn't know that in 12 minutes, she'd walk out of that room having touched nothing but a doorknob and still be called a thief. The exam room was colder than the lobby. Its walls were painted a muted cream, meant to calm nerves, but the chill from the air vent above the examination table made Amina's skin contract. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Dr. Halbert did not speak at first. She tapped notes into her tablet, occasionally glancing over her glasses with clinical detachment. Amina offered a tentative smile. "Is everything okay with the baby?" she asked, soft but steady. The doctor didn't answer. She merely motioned to the table. "Lie back, please." Amina obeyed. The gel was cold. The wand moved across her belly. The machine beeped. The heartbeat, strong and steady, echoed through the room like a drum buried under layers of cotton. Then, without warning, Dr. Halbert stepped away, eyes narrowed at the tray beside the sink. Her posture changed. She glanced at her wrist. Her expression hardened. "Where's my watch?" she asked abruptly. Amina blinked. I don't know. I didn't see a watch." "You didn't see it?" the doctor repeated, as if testing the sentence for weakness. "No, ma'am, I just came in. Sat down." But Dr. Halbert wasn't listening anymore. She stepped out of the room without a word, the door clicking shut behind her with an audible finality. Amina sat up slowly, heart pounding. She could still hear the baby's heartbeat ringing in her ears. 3 minutes later, 2 security guards entered. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one said, already stepping forward. "Is something wrong?" she asked, rising carefully. "Was there—" "Just come with us," the other interrupted, tone clipped. He took her elbow, not roughly, but without permission. Her skin bristled at the contact. They didn't lead her out the main hallway. They took her through a side door, down a maintenance corridor that smelled of bleach and basement, into a small office with no windows. A camera above the door blinked red. "Your phone, please." I don't understand," Amina said, clutching her bag. "Your phone." She handed it over. Then silence. No explanation. No offer of water. No update on the child whose heartbeat had pulsed so bravely minutes before. Instead, a slow suffocation of space, of dignity. After 10 minutes, a nurse entered. She didn't introduce herself. "We've reviewed the situation," she said. "What situation?" Amina asked. "The missing watch. Dr. Halbert's Cartier was on the tray. It's gone. You were the last person in the room." "I didn't take anything. I didn't even touch the counter." The nurse's lips pressed together in a way that said, "I've heard this before." Amina's chest tightened. "You think I stole it? We're just following protocol." "No, you're not," Amina said, voice trembling now. "If I were white sitting here in a cashmere coat, you wouldn't be locking me in a room without telling me why." The nurse flinched, but said nothing. She left, and Amina was alone again, in that chair, in that cold, in that accusation that never even asked her a question, just decided what she was. Amina sat in the dim security room for 37 minutes. Not once did she cry. Not when they took her phone. Not when a third guard entered, looked her up and down, and left without saying a word. Not even when the same nurse returned with a clipboard and a sterile tone, stating that an investigation would be ongoing, and she was free to leave, for now. She simply rose, gathered her things, and walked out the side exit where no one would see her go. But someone had seen. Halfway down the staff stairwell, as she reached the landing between the third and fourth floors, she heard the echo of a familiar voice, firm, clipped, unmistakable. Malcolm. He had arrived. By the time Amina reached the first floor, he was already at the front desk, showing his badge. His gray suit barely creased, his presence slicing through the waiting room like a scalpel through gauze. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Authority followed him like gravity. The receptionist stammered. A supervisor was called, then security, then the director of patient services. And as the clinic scrambled to contain the fire they had just ignited, Amina stepped through the sliding doors and into the eye of the storm. Malcolm turned. Their eyes met. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in the relief of not having to carry the weight alone anymore. He crossed the room in 4 strides, placed a hand gently on her arm, and whispered, "I've got you." No tears. No collapse. Just a quiet nod. Back in the security room, the footage was cued. Malcolm asked questions no one wanted to answer, demanded timestamps, access logs, chain of custody documentation. Amina stood beside him, silent, steady, bearing witness. At 10:41 a.m., the video showed her entering exam room 3 alone. No bag, no hesitation, just the careful steps of a woman trying not to be mistaken for something dangerous. She touched only the chair and the doorknob. At 10:52, Dr. Halbert exited, glanced at the tray, touched her bare wrist, and stormed off. "Freeze," Malcolm said. The frame locked. The tray beside the tissue box, where the Cartier watch supposedly lay, was visible. Zoomed in, it was empty. "Roll forward." At 10:54, a janitor entered the room. He didn't touch the tray. At 10:59, the watch still hadn't appeared. Then the camera glitched. Feed lost. "What happened to the footage?" Malcolm asked. "Shift change," one of the guards muttered. "Cleaning crew's system takes over. There's a 5-minute window with no surveillance." "A blind spot?" Malcolm repeated. "How convenient." The room went still. One officer wiped sweat from his upper lip. Amina hadn't spoken yet. Now she did. "Give me my phone." Malcolm turned, opened a drawer, and retrieved it. Her hands closed around the device as if it were breath itself. The screen lit up. Missed calls. A dozen messages. One from her best friend. one from her OB, two from the school district's hiring board. But she didn't open any of them. She looked up, her voice steady. "I want to speak to your ethics board. Today." The glass doors to the Eastbrook Medical Executive floor hissed open with a hush too gentle for the chaos it was about to witness. Amina stepped out of the elevator flanked by Malcolm. The carpet muffled their steps, but not their presence. Every eye in the hallway turned. Receptionists paused, mid-keystroke. A physician slowed mid-sentence. Not because Amina was back, but because of who walked beside her now. Malcolm Hart wasn't wearing a gun or issuing threats. He didn't need to. The gold federal badge clipped to his belt spoke volumes. Volumes louder than fear, louder than race, louder than policy. They were led to a glass conference room where sunlight poured in from tall windows, as if justice itself had finally decided to witness the proceedings. Inside, 3 members of the hospital's internal ethics board waited at the far end of a long table. 2 men, 1 woman, all white, all visibly tense. Their faces carried the tight-lipped professionalism of people trying to calculate damage control in real time. And at the opposite end, seated like nothing had changed, was Dr. Lindsay Halbert. Her jaw clenched, her eyes cold, her arms crossed in a posture of authority. But the slight twitch at her temple betrayed the cracks forming beneath. Amina sat without being asked. Malcolm remained standing. The chair of the board cleared his throat. "Mr. Hart, Mrs. Wells, we've reviewed preliminary footage. We understand there was an incident involving an accusation." Malcolm reached into his briefcase and placed a thin stack of papers on the table with surgical precision. Not just an accusation, a false accusation, a violation of civil rights, illegal detainment, and medical negligence against a pregnant black woman. He paused. "Who also happens to be my wife." The room chilled. "We have video footage confirming no theft occurred. We have timestamp discrepancies that conveniently cover a 5-minute blind spot in your surveillance. We have audio, recorded on my wife's phone, of Dr. Halbert making prejudiced and degrading assumptions before any object was reported missing." Dr. Halbert scoffed. "This is absurd. I followed protocol. I had reason to—" "No," Malcolm cut in, his voice dropping into a razor's edge. "You had assumptions. You didn't see a woman. You saw a problem, a body without context. You saw skin tone, not behavior. You saw the absence of a man and filled it with your own bias." Dr. Halbert's eyes flashed. "I made a professional judgment." Amina's voice interrupted her. Quiet, clear. "You looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was furniture in a place too clean for me to touch." She leaned forward. "You told me I looked like I came from a bus station. You said I was probably alone." As if that justified calling security instead of speaking to me like a human being. Silence draped over the room like smoke. Malcolm stepped forward again. "This isn't about a watch. It's about power, and how you used it to humiliate, detain, and endanger someone under your care. That's not just unethical, it's actionable." He slid a second document forward. "We're pursuing this through federal civil rights litigation, but we're also demanding immediate institutional action, a public apology, mandatory anti-bias training, policy reform, and Dr. Halbert's full suspension pending investigation." The chair of the board cleared his throat, voice dry. We will begin proceedings immediately." Dr. Halbert stood suddenly, her chair screeching back. She left the room without a word. No one stopped her. No one followed. 3 days after the ethics hearing, the official statement arrived. It was printed on Eastbrook Medical's letterhead, signed by the Director of Operations, and sent to every major news outlet in the region. It read with the politeness of legal shielding, but the content was undeniable. We acknowledge that on the morning of April 17, 2025, a patient under our care was subject to a wrongful accusation and procedural misconduct. Eastbrook Medical is committed to reviewing and restructuring its internal bias training, patient treatment protocols, and surveillance accountability. Dr. Lindsay Halbert has been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending further investigation. Amina read it once, then again. It was not an apology, not really, but it was a record, and records, she knew, could not be erased. The real apology came 2 days later in a smaller, less public room, this time at a town hall meeting hosted by the Glenfield City Health Committee. Amina sat on a folding chair in the front row while an assistant to the medical board read a prepared statement aloud. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the fact that they were spoken, on record, in front of cameras, in front of witnesses. But for Amina, vindication wasn't a finish line. It was a doorway, and she intended to walk through it. 2 weeks after that rainy April morning, a podium was erected on the sidewalk outside Eastbrook Medical. No press release announced it, but word spread fast, by phone, by tweet, by silent agreement. People showed up. Some wore suits, some wore scrubs, some held signs that read, "I believe Amina." Others wore shirts that simply said, "Enough." Malcolm stood behind her, hands at his sides, expression unreadable, but every muscle in his posture screamed pride. Beside him stood 2 local civil rights attorneys, one nurse from the clinic who had quietly quit, and a mother whose own daughter had been mistaken for suspicious in a different waiting room, 1 town over. And Amina, dressed in a deep navy dress that curved gently over her belly, stepped to the microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice measured, rich with gravity. "This is about every black woman who's been told she doesn't belong. Every patient whose dignity was weighed against someone else's assumption of guilt. Every quiet room where the word protocol is used to disguise prejudice." She paused. "And it's about what happens when we stop shrinking." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, like the inhale before a storm, like the crowd was holding its collective breath, not in fear, but in respect. "We will not be quiet," Amina continued. "We will not be afraid. And we will not disappear just to make you comfortable." Someone in the crowd clapped. Once. Then again. And then the street rang with applause. Not loud, but heavy, like a verdict being read. Malcolm reached for her hand. And as Amina turned slightly, her other hand resting on her stomach, she allowed herself the first real smile in weeks. Not because the fight was over, but because something had finally begun. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the news vans had folded their tripods, Amina sat alone in the nursery that wasn't finished yet. The walls were still bare. The crib was unassembled. A single unopened box of diapers leaned awkwardly in the corner. She sat in the rocking chair Malcolm had surprised her with a month ago. It creaked gently beneath her, each motion carving a quiet rhythm into the hush of the room. Outside, dusk draped itself across the skyline like a velvet curtain. Inside, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel not just relief, not just anger, but the deeper ache beneath both. The slow-burning truth that what had happened to her had happened to so many before, and would likely happen again, unless someone made it stop. She looked down at her hands, dark, calloused, beautiful, and then to her belly. "I fought today," she whispered softly, unsure whether she was speaking to herself or to the life growing inside her. "Not just for me, but for you. For what the world will try to make you believe you are, and for everything I need you to know you already are." Her voice cracked then, not from weakness, but from the weight of carrying strength too long without setting it down. She leaned back, eyes drifting to the ceiling. People would say she was brave, but bravery, she knew, wasn't about the speech or the cameras or the lawsuit. It was about refusing to accept invisibility. It was about walking back into the room that tried to erase you and making sure no one ever forgot your name again. 3 months later, Eastbrook Medical rolled out a new policy initiative titled the Amina Protocol, mandating implicit bias training, equitable patient treatment standards, and real-time access to grievance pathways for all patients. It was small, imperfect, but real. Journalists reached out for interviews. She accepted a few, declined most. Her goal had never been the spotlight. Her goal was the mirror, to hold it up, steady, unflinching, and dare the system to look. And slowly, in corners she couldn't yet see, it began to. The day her son was born, the nurses called her brave again. But she smiled differently this time, because now, when they said it, they weren't just referring to the delivery or the pain or the labor. They meant the woman who had walked into a medical room alone and walked out carrying not just a baby, but a cause. And as she held him to her chest, her son's eyes blinking up at her, curious, unbothered, whole, Amina whispered, "You belong." Don't ever let them forget it. We share these stories not to stir anger, but to awaken empathy, to bear witness, and to remind each other that dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you're born with. If this story moved you, support voices like Amina's. Like, share, subscribe, and above all, stay loud even in silence.